Oh, good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to our discussion event on all the trouble in the world. Hopefully, we will have a few more people filter in, but since it's after 4 o'clock, I think we should go ahead and get things started. This is a virtual panel discussion being hosted by the Department of History and Political Science and the School of Arts and Letters here at Middle Georgia State University, and co-sponsored by the Middle Georgia State University Political Science Student Organization, as well as the Alpha Mu Zeta chapter of Pi Sigma Alpha, which is the National Honorary Society for Political Science. Before we do get started, I do want to introduce a few of our programs here in political science here at MGA. So we have a Bachelor of Science degree in Political Science, as well as the Bachelor of Science degree in Interdisciplinary Studies, as well as minors in Political Science, African Diaspora Studies, Environmental Policy Studies, Local Government Administration, Global Studies, and Pre-Law, as well as the Certificate in European Union Studies that is a collaboration between several different University System of Georgia institutions and ourselves. So first, I will go ahead and introduce our panelists, although we seem to be short of panelists, so hopefully he's able to make it. But as of the moment, at least, we have two of our three panelists, so I'll go ahead and introduce them first. First, we have Dr. Matthew Caverly, who's an assistant professor of public safety here at Middle Georgia State University. He has been at Middle Georgia State in various capacities since 2015 and is his doctorate in political sciences from the University of Florida. Also, we have Dr. John Hall, who's an associate professor of political science and has been here at Middle Georgia State also since 2015. And his doctorate is in public policy administration from Auburn University. Let's see. I'm not sure if he's going to be able to make it and join us tonight. I know he is in Europe and so maybe away from the internet or maybe having internet trouble or something. I'm not sure. I haven't heard from him. But if he is able to join us, Dr. Matchock, Dr. Thomas Matchock, is an associate professor of public safety, so he may be joining us later. And then I am Dr. Christopher Lawrence. I'm a professor of political science here at Middle Georgia State University. I'll be serving as your moderator today, and we will go over some event rules before we get started here. First, we have the panelists and I have discussed some potential questions, and we'll get started with those, but at least some of those. But if you have your questions, we're always happy to add those as well to our discussion. So if you do have a question, please post it in the chat window, and we'll try to get to those as they arrive. Couple ground rules on that. Please know that you're more than welcome to ask multiple questions, but we will prioritize one question per participant if we do get a lot of participation there. And do be courteous and civil to each other in the chat window. Some of these issues that we're discussing may be controversial, so that doesn't mean you can't have a spirited discussion. But do bear in mind the rules of the university policies about civil discourse and things like that during our discussions. So speaking of potential topics, so some of the topics we may address this evening include the Russian-Ukrainian war, as well as Russia's involvement in Moldova, which is another country nearby. The conflict involving Israel and Hamas, and now co-starring Hezbollah and Iran and probably other regional actors as we speak. Also, potential topics include U.S.-Mexican relations and the new president of Mexico, as well as some escalating conflicts with India over their targeting of Sikh separatist leaders on U.S. and Canadian soil, which has led to a diplomatic spat between Canada and India and may lead to some spillover effects in the U.S. as well, because some more things may be going on here. So anyway, without too much further ado, I think we'll go ahead and start our discussion. So first, I guess we'll start with our first question. So, what is the current situation in the conflict between Russia and Ukraine? Dr. Hall, do you want to kick that one off?
Yes, thank you, Chris. Thank you, Matt, for being here. I'd like to thank all of the students for being here as well. We have a light audience tonight compared to others, but that means we have the best students imaginable here with us tonight. No pressure on those questions in the chat, but please ask them if any come up. Now, regarding the crisis/war in Ukraine, just to catch everyone up to speed from the war's beginning back in 2022, Russia, as we know, has invaded, the world would say illegally invaded the liberal democracy of Ukraine back in 2022. This invasion was expected by the Russians to last several days. Western military leaders would have thought that this would not last very long, maybe a couple of weeks. The Russians would take Kyiv, the capital, and then probably put in a puppet regime to then consolidate their control over Ukraine. As we're well over 2.5 years beyond that point, obviously the Ukrainians have put forth a heroic effort to successfully continue to fight off the Russians, who have still not yet subjugated the nation. Not to say yet, I don't mean to suggest that that's inevitable. But over the last 2.5 years, a couple of important things have happened after major incursions into eastern Ukraine, where there was a great deal of support for the Russian regime. The Russians hit kind of a stalemate. They weren't able to really push much further. There was also an extraordinarily successful Ukrainian counterattack not long after the invasion occurred. Since then, it has been something of a war of attrition. There are hundreds of thousands of Russians, hundreds of thousands of Ukrainians involved. The most recent events have involved an offensive by the Ukrainians into Russia, this being one of the very first times since World War II that there has been a significant invasion into Russian territory. Now, there's no threat that the Ukrainians are going to conquer Russia. The Ukrainians aren't trying to conquer Russia. They're trying to bleed off some of those Russian forces from the south and from the east. And to this day, they still have and have held for several months Russian territory in the Kursk region, which is in southwestern Russia. While the Russians have been able to successfully take back about half of that land, what is happening currently that is interesting, for lack of a better word, is that several Russian allies have been contributing to the war effort, most specifically North Korea. This is something that is quite unique. The North Koreans reportedly have about 10,000 soldiers in Russia training right now, upwards of 1,000 to 2,000 that might actually be in the Kursk region. Again, if Russia were the United States, the Kursk region, I'm going to say roughly would be in the California area, kind of south and to the west. So in response to the invasion by the Ukrainians, meant to bleed forces from the rest of their country to that area, trying to force the Russians to focus on their own territory, possibly making Russian civilians think that the promises that the administration has made that they're not at risk are not actually coming true. Thousands of North Korean soldiers in the Kursk region would possibly help alleviate some of the pressure on the Russians. That's one way of looking at it. There's no doubt that Iran and China are also, of course, strong allies with Russia, but it's North Korea as of right now that's actually putting boots on the ground in Russia. Now, what effects would that have on the war? It's impossible to tell. On the one hand, having an ally send thousands of troops to help you in a combat area could be advantageous. On the other hand, these are North Korean soldiers. And if you are a Russian officer, there's a very good chance you speak Russian. And there's a very good chance these North Koreans don't speak Russian. The Russians are actually putting advisors who speak North Korean or who speak Korean with these soldiers. So there is the possibility that this causes more of a headache for the Russians than it does an advantage. We don't know that yet. These North Korean soldiers, by definition, have not been in actual active combat since the 1950s. And they will be going up against hardened Ukrainian soldiers who have been fighting Russian soldiers for over 2.5 years. So I question if this complement of North Korean soldiers will be that impactful. I could be very wrong, not questioning the skill of North Korean soldiers, but there's a great deal of communication issues that the Russians might be dealing with. So overall, that's the fastest summary I can give you of the illegal Russian war in Ukraine. In terms of a possible peaceful settlement in the near future, I don't want to, I'm generally more optimistic, but I see no peaceful solution. I think the best possible option for the war in Ukraine ending would be a regime change in Moscow, which I don't see happening. I think if that were going to happen, it would have happened already. There's also the possibility or the question of how this could possibly affect the 2024 election. Again, that's something that's going to be somewhat impossible to tell. Both of the candidates have nominally come out in favor of Ukraine. There is a wavering in the Trump camp. President Trump, former President Trump, has said that if elected, he will end the war in Ukraine in one day. As exciting as that sounds, I have no idea what he means when he says that. He has not given any itemized plan as to how to do that. Vice President Harris has quite strongly come out in support of the Biden administration's ongoing plan to support Ukraine, which we have been doing for over 2.5 years. Congress has appropriated around $170 billion for the Ukrainian war effort. Not all of that has been actually paid out, but a great deal of that, the lion's share, has been in terms of military aid. And it's important to note when you hear that the U.S. is spending tens of billions of dollars in Ukraine, a lot of that money is actually being spent in the United States. Most U.S. weapon systems are built in the United States. So when the U.S. sends, say, Patriot missile systems to Ukraine, those are being built in the U.S. Those are being built with paychecks that go to American workers. A lot of that money is actually going to resupply and restock American assets that have already been sent to Ukraine. But in terms of the future, this war, unfortunately, has been a war of attrition for 2.5 years. I think it will continue to be, and I see absolutely no end in sight. I hate to end on such a depressing note, but on that note, I'm going to hand it over to Dr. Caverly.
Good day, everybody. Thank you for coming to our little panel here today. And John, thank you for starting us out here. I don't have much to add in terms of the summary. I think the summary was excellent as to where we're at. The only thing that I would say is very interesting. There's some different interesting things about the current conflict. One is the spread of the borders, the spread of other countries, third-party intervention coming in on the side of the Russians. I think that was something that was not really predicted for, and what this will mean regarding North Korea's military readiness, I don't know. I don't know what this could be. I mean, I'm very skeptical that Vladimir Putin is going to want to have hordes of a million-man North Korean army running across his country to hit eastern Ukraine. But nonetheless, it is a bit terrifying because North Korea is a nuclear power. Now, it's a very limited nuclear power, but it is a nuclear power. And they can rain down destruction with mortar and artillery and rocket fire on South Korea in a matter of moments. Quite frankly, Seoul is right up near the 38th parallel. I don't know how many people have ever been to Korea, but that's not that far. And the risk of the Russian intervention or the North Korean intervention with ground troops significantly ratchets up the potential for a larger conflict. The other thing I would say that has been a bit fascinating on this is the advent of technology and tactics that have appeared and manifested in this war. One, on the Russian side, you've had them move to a partial mobilization, which is something they haven't done in decades. And on the other side, the Ukrainians have been very interesting because they have kind of kept the best of the Soviet doctrine. For those of you who have some interest in military affairs, but the Soviet doctrine was always to hit hard, to hit heavy, and to stay long. And how they managed to do that with a lot of mechanized, armored, and motorized forces. But they were very top down and led sort of big operations in a big way. And the Russians still continue in that, largely in that area. The Ukrainians, who were once part of the Soviet Union, they came up with that. But due to their training by NATO, particularly by the United States, they have significantly moderated their own efforts at combat, which I think is really attributed a lot to their ability to hold off Ivan. They've learned small unit tactics, and they've learned the value of non-commissioned officer tactical leadership on the ground. And they've also technologically been able to employ new implements of warfare like drones, which have been around a while, but I mean they haven't been used in this tactical fashion at any conflict before this. So it's rather interesting if you see that the implication of this. One of our other topics is Gaza. How they got Sinwar was they got him with a drone. I mean, they identified him with a drone, and then a tank took him out. But this is just showing how modern warfare is back, but it's back with a new sort of twist to it. But it is scary what's going on. When you have great powers, nuclear powers that can marshal tremendous forces on Europe, that's a scary thing. And as a bit of a segue into the next question, I will say this: a lot of people wonder, why does Russia do this? Don't they have anything better to do? Well, Russia has a long history of what they call the near abroad, which is Russia's version of imperialization, and they would occupy countries and regions, peoples that were on their periphery, and they used those as a buffer to protect them. And so that was what lied behind the creation of the Warsaw Pact that the students on here learn about in their history classes. But what Putin is trying to do is to recreate the near abroad. And he does it diplomatically, he does it economically, and most flagrantly in certain areas, he does it militarily and using intelligence assets. And we see this in Ukraine, and we're also seeing it in Moldova and some other areas around there. But anyway, as usual, I've talked too much, so I will. Let's see, what else we got here. Prospects for peaceful settlement. I agree with John. There's no. I don't see anything on the horizon unless related to C here. How might the U.S. election impact the conflict? So there's folks out there, and it's a little bit conspiratorial, who think that if President Trump becomes the once and future president, if he becomes that he's going to pull the money. And if he pulls the money, that will force the EU and it will force NATO to have to step up in a way that they haven't. And a lot of security analysts claim that they don't have the monetary and the military power to do it. If that is true, which it may not be, but if that is true, then Ukraine could be in a lot of trouble. Now, one thing we all know about the former president is that a lot of times he says things and it doesn't necessarily mean anything. So we'll see what happens, but that is one way in which it could impact. Now, I believe Harris would probably, it seems that she would just continue the course that was set by Biden, and there probably wouldn't be too much of a change. She might have a predilection to try for a more diplomatic solution than to rely so much on military assets. But overall, she has promised that she's going to stick with them, and I think that she will. If there's going to be any variability, it'll possibly come from President Trump. But again, even then, it's hard to tell sometimes with what does President Trump really mean. I mean, I caught that too when John brought up he'll end it in a day. I don't know unless he gets on there with Zelensky and says, well, I'm going to pull the money, so you got to cut a deal with Putin, and of course Putin takes the eastern third of Ukraine. But in the long term, that might bring peace in the short term, but in the long term, that's going to cause a bigger war. And what I mean by a bigger war, that'll mean a war that'll involve us. And I don't think people really want to see that. Okay, anyway, I'm gonna shut up.
Okay, thanks. Thanks both John and Matt. So we have a follow-up question from the chat related to this. So Dr. McRae actually asks, looking at the North Korean forces issue back at the moment, what might be some of the advantages for that government to get involved in the dispute that would outweigh the risk to their soldiers?
That's a great question. My honest answer would be, I have no idea. I don't know necessarily why a nation state like North Korea, that is perpetually wrecked with poverty for the vast majority of its people, are spending resources to help a much larger, much more powerful nation state like Russia in a war of choice like this. However, they would be helping Russia. So I would say that would be the biggest advantage. Russia is a key ally to North Korea. I wouldn't argue that they are more important than China is, because they're not. But this is a strong ally of North Korea. North Korea is one of the more ostracized regimes on the planet Earth, and the North Koreans would be able to help Russia, and Russia would know they were helping, and I'm sure there would be some resources going back to Pyongyang as a result. Outside of winning points with Russia, if I were in command in Pyongyang, I would make a lot of changes, but I see this as being overwhelmingly dangerous. Again, nothing against the North Korean forces, because I can't say anything about the North Korean forces. They have not fought a major war since the 1950s. And just thinking about the prospects of, by definition, green, rookie in terms of experience, North Korean soldiers, not taking away from their bravery or their fighting skills or their training. I don't like their odds, at least on day one, if they were to follow the Russian strategy against these hardened Ukrainian soldiers. The Russian strategy, again, I'm oversimplifying a bit, but not by much, is to send your soldiers into a meat grinder, fight a war of attrition, use excessive levels of artillery and armored divisions, and win wars like that. That would be unimaginable for U.S. commanders, but the Putin regime, I think it's safe to say, is not overwhelmingly concerned with the safety and the lives of their soldiers. They are willing to use wave after wave to take a couple of miles. And I think that might be the way the North Korean soldiers would be used, if they're used at all. They might be used in the back to secure areas, to free up Russian soldiers who can then move to the front. So I'm getting off the target here. In terms of what are the advantages for North Koreans considering the risks to their soldiers, I would say would be getting in good with Russia and staying on the good side of Moscow and getting some reciprocity on the back end.
Generally, I would agree. This is a public relations opportunity for the great leader there in North Korea. This is so he can flex his muscles, so that he can seem to be more, bigger and badder and tougher a player on the global stage in a way that North Korea has not been since really the height of the Cold War in the 1960s. They had the Pueblo incident and that sort of thing. It will give the North Koreans and the Russians an opportunity to build up their communications and infrastructure, or communication logistical connections. So there's some military thing there. It does provide an opportunity for North Korea to indirectly saber rattle against the South, as they say, look what we sent troops abroad and we're hitting them there. And guess what? Seoul is just a few miles down the road. But it seems to be more of a political ploy than anything else. As far as the risk to the soldiers go, there is something called the Eastern Way of War. and it is highly practiced by the North Koreans. And what it really comes down to is that if you lose 100 men to take the hill, it was worth it to take the hill. And it's not that they don't value human life, they do. They value it in a different way than we do in the West. And so if you ever talk to old, I mean, they're really old now, but if you ever talk to old veterans of the Korean War and veterans of people who fought in the Pacific against the Japanese, where they would talk about the human wave attacks, the Banzai attacks, and that sort of thing, that's consistent with, you know, Mao Zedong's Little Red Book was consistent with how you win a long-term struggle. They don't worry as much about losing human life. You know, Stalin held Stalingrad mostly because the Russian soldiers knew if they turned and retreated, the Commissars would kill them, and so better to die by the Wehrmacht than by the Commissar, and so it worked. Now, would that really work in the modern world with modern communicative technologies and so on and so forth, and even a hermit kingdom like North Korea? Those people get stuff from us, and so I'm not sure that even that whole doctrine will hold in a full out struggle, but we would see. It's a scary. They're a tough power. Don't underestimate them.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, I think the only thing I would add to that is just simply that, you know, the North Koreans may be doing it for economic reasons. You know, that may be an opportunity um, for the Kim regime to, you know, get some sort of financial benefit from Russia. You know, they do need hard currency. They do need, you know, resources that Russia can offer them, and so, you know, this might be, you know, almost a mercenary sort of transaction where, you know, the Russians and maybe to some extent the Chinese are saying, you know, well, you know, if you want to keep getting stuff from us, you know, you need to give us something. And, you know, what North Korea has is a bunch of soldiers, and not a lot else. So, so this might be the sort of deal that makes sense to Kim, even if it doesn't make a lot of sense necessarily to Kim's soldiers or to their, you know, own personal self-preservation or anything like that, right? You know, I mean, I don't think the North Korean government in any way really cares all that much about the welfare of its soldiers, except to the extent that they don't rise up and depose the regime. But and that could be you know, that's another factor too, right? Is if, you know, if you have a bunch of soldiers in North Korea, they can't be in North Korea trying to depose the regime. Now, there's a downside to that. If they come back and come up with some foreign ideas, like, you know, like some capitalism or something, that can be a real problem for the regime. But I think, you know, Kim may be banking on the fact that probably not a lot of them are going to come back. So, you know, and that actually solves a few problems, right? In the sense of, you know, they've had famine in North Korea for a while, and while they do need some soldiers for to maintain order and things like that, and to, you know, maintain the threat against the South. Maybe getting rid of a, you know, few thousand soldiers wouldn't be the worst thing from Kim's perspective, particularly if it buys him some goodwill from Putin in particular. So, so anyway, just some considerations to bear in mind there, not to get too conspiratorial, but you know, again, you can't really. I think you're both making good points in the sense that you can't really think about this from the same sort of mindset that, you know, American commanders would be using in the same sort of circumstance, right? Where, it would be a very hard sell in America to say we need to send troops to even a NATO ally to defend against a Russian attack, much less Ukraine. But that's not a consideration for certainly the Korean regime or North Korean regime, I would think. Let's see. So, Dr. Caverly alluded to this a little bit earlier, and I think I'll let him take the lead on this. So, Russia is your may be aware, also being accused of trying to meddle in recent elections in Moldova, and then also, I guess, the elections in the country of Georgia, not to be confused with the state of Georgia as well. First, can you give a little bit of background on what Moldova, I guess Georgia as well, why these countries are important from the perspective of Russia and why they become a focal point for conflict in the post-Soviet era, and then also, how might these interventions affect other sort of territorial issues where Russia's been involved, in places like, for example, Armenia or maybe Kazakhstan and places like that as well.
Thank you, Chris. Well, again, I go back to the whole Russian imperialism based on the near abroad. So Moldova was at one time a republic within the Soviet Union, and before that, it was a part of the Russian Empire. And if you, sometimes you have to. So a lot of times politicians will talk out of both sides of their mouth, and you got to try and read through the tea leaves and figure out what in the world you're getting at. You don't really have to do that with Mr. Putin. Mr. Putin, when he says, and he says this often, that the dissolution of the Soviet Union was the worst event in the history of the world. That's what you should take him at his word. He believes that. That's not political rhetoric. He believes that. And so the successor states, the Soviet successor states, of which Moldova is one, there's been a long-standing effort by the Russians, and particularly that effort it actually began with Yeltsin, but it's accelerated under Putin, to, if you will, undo what the Cold War did, which was destroy the Soviet Union. So again, they follow a range of tactics. They use sabotage and subterfuge and assassination, terrorism, and they operate through mercenary groups, and they operate through organized crime networks, and they follow a series of tactics that are really all involved in the one strategy. The one strategy is to reassert the near abroad. And right now, in what this has caused domestically for the Soviet successor states, is that there's a within politics it is almost permanently attached to the Russians, because the way that Russia engaged in what was called an internal colonization program, and this goes way back. Peter the Great started it, I believe it was. They would send ethnic Russians into the occupied territories, and so those Russians have been living there, and their families have been living there, and they've kept their Russian culture and their Russian heritage, and that was done purposely to connect Russia to its near abroad. Well, that is produced in the Soviet successor states. That's produced a domestic politics where there's a battle that the different parties align around in these various countries as either being pro-Russian or anti-Russian. And so, depending upon what regime is in power at what time in one of these successor states, is really kind of how their near diplomatic relations and trade relations work. Right now, Moldova is under a pro-Russian regime, and so what's going on in Moldova is you have a group of people who are on the outside who would like a greater separation with the Russians, and so the Russia through their satellites, if you will, in Moldova, and also their own intelligence communication networks, are filling Moldova and their elections with all kinds of misinformation and disinformation, and this kind of thing, which we know well of in our country because we are not immune to the Russians' activities in our own elections. They're masters at this. This is a part of, it's the same strategy they employ in the Ukraine. The difference is that in the Ukraine, they're using actual armored and mechanized and motorized forces to fight. In a place like Moldova, they're operating more through intelligence networks and attachments with domestic agents and so on and so forth. But it all comes down to the recreation and the maintenance of the near abroad to unmake what the Cold War did. The peoples of the near abroad, of the Soviet successor states, are trapped in an ongoing narrative. Shall they go east or shall they go west? And they bounce back and forth depending upon who wins what election or who occupies wherever you're at. And so that's really where we're at. It's a direct legacy of the Soviet era. Now, as far as how this impacts other territorial issues, they're all in this. They're all in this. Kazakhstan is in this. Azerbaijan is in this. Armenia is in this. Georgia is in this. They're all involved, and there's basically an ongoing thing. The pro-Western forces want these successor states as much as possible to either link directly or indirectly with the EU for trade and with NATO for security. And of course, Russia regards both of those as anathema. They feel that there's a zero-sum game to them. If somebody goes over to NATO or somebody goes over to EU, that means somebody that they've lost. And so, if you will, it's kind of a little small version of the old Cold War, without the communism, I guess, more with nationalism and imperialism. But nonetheless, I think that's where we're at, and it's a scary thing. But if you look at this in a more broad thing, this has been going on really almost since the Cold War ended. This stuff's been going on in one place or another in that near abroad ever since the 90s. And so it does predate Putin, but Putin has took it to the nth degree. And again, because you got to believe him when he says that he wants to essentially recreate the Soviet Empire. And as usual, I've spoken too much.
That's a great summary. I really don't have a lot to add, especially to the history. I would point out that this recent election, it really had two incredibly important votes for Moldova in terms of where they're going in the future. Their incumbent president, Sandu, she is pro-EU, pro-Western, and she won, but she did not win a majority. She won a little over 40%. So she, like anyone running for office in Georgia, now has to go into a runoff, and that is going to be a tight runoff. There are a number of what we would refer to as third, fourth, fifth party candidates who are now out, and where their allegiance lies, I think you will see a lot of pro-Russian sentiment in that runoff. That is an incredibly important runoff that I think is just a couple of days from now. It's coming up early November. So from a pro-Western, pro-EU stance, in terms of which direction will Moldova go, that was positive, but the runoff election could be dangerous for Moldova's future. I didn't mean to say dangerous if they go pro-Russian, that's necessarily bad, but in this environment, it might be. There was also a referendum that I think might be as important as the presidential election, and that was to chart a path either toward the EU or not. And there was an incredibly bare majority. I think it was like 50.2% of the population voted in favor of going in the direction of the EU. You could question if that's enough support. Moldova is definitely divided, as Dr. Caverly pointed out. There are strong pro-Russian forces and pro-Russian sentiment there, and it is wavering. It's important to note that geographically, Russia's here, Moldova's here, Russia's here, Ukraine is here, and Moldova is right on the other side. If you were going southwest, so it is very, very close in the region. Obviously, being a former Soviet satellite state, the future of Moldova, I think, is going to be dictated by the future of Ukraine. I think if what President Putin thought was going to happen, what his advisors told him was going to happen in his little echo chamber, if they had subjugated Ukraine immediately or within a few months, Moldova, I believe, would already be back within the Russian Federation right now. So Ukraine is something of a buffer for Moldova. Those pro-Western forces are desperately hoping that Ukraine can continue to survive as an independent sovereign nation state. Those pro-Russian forces in Moldova clearly want the opposite. But I believe it's not automatic, but I think if Ukraine falls, Moldova falls afterwards. Because like Ukraine, Moldova is not in NATO. And while he has made some risky decisions and his rhetoric has been beyond irresponsible regarding nuclear weapons, President Putin is not going to attack a NATO nation state. Not necessarily to prevent, I can't say that. I don't think President Putin would ever attack a NATO nation state. Not necessarily because of the threat of nuclear annihilation that would follow. That wouldn't necessarily immediately follow. I think President Putin knows, especially seeing what his conventional military has done, or more to the point, not done in Ukraine. I think he knows what would happen if there was a conventional war between NATO forces and Russia, and it would not end well for Russia. And unfortunately, that might end in nuclear annihilation. So I think I've escalated this discussion to nuclear Armageddon too quickly. But Moldova, it is definitely at a crossroads. And so far, it looks to be inching toward the West, inching toward the EU. But there's a very important election coming up in a couple of days, and we will see.
Okay, thank you very much. So it looks like Tom has been able to join us. I don't know if he has anything he wants to add to our discussion on either Moldova or the Russia-Ukraine conflict. So I will let him do so if he is able to. I know it looks like he's having some trouble with his camera, perhaps.
Yeah, well, and sorry for the delay getting on, but with the time change, and I think the EU has already gone to made its change, time change. So instead of 6 hours, it's 5 hours. So everything working against me here. My camera's not working. The time has changed, but no, glad to be here and hear your comments, John. Certainly, coming in late and not knowing where the conversation has been going, but talking about the Russia-Ukraine war, of course. I think.
And Tom, one thing before you do say anything, I do believe you have to give a disclaimer before you can say anything.
Oh, thank you so much. Thank you so much for reminding me, Chris. Please, anything that I do say is my opinion, mine alone, and is not representative of the Department of Security Cooperation, nor the Marshall Center where I'm at today. So yes, thank you so much for that, Chris. Again, anything I say is simply the opinion of Tom Matchok. But as we are talking about Russia and Ukraine, it's this continued threat to the rules-based international order, I think, that is at the heart of all of this. Certainly, we just looked at in the past days the BRICS conference in Russia, and the movement against this rules-based international order is I think the most significant thing on the table right now, which points to why what is happening in Ukraine is of utmost importance to all of us in the certainly the democratic West. So that, I guess, is my point. And again, not having heard where the conversation had been going, but it's this continued threat against the RBIO, again, using hybrid threats. John, as I heard you saying when I came on again at the latter part of your talk, whether Russia would attack a NATO nation and activate Article 5 of the treaty, that's we don't know, I certainly sort of lean toward your point that that would not be a good move on Russia's part. That would not be something they would want to do. But then again, I didn't think they'd attack Ukraine either. So, but looking at that, it's these ongoing hybrid threats that are the new battlefield today. We just looked at the election in Georgia and the involvement of Russia in the Georgian election, and supporting the party that leans back towards Russia. So we're beginning to see more and more of these hybrid threats that are threatening this RBIO, questioning legitimacy of elections, legitimacy of their own governments. So I think where I'm looking at it today, it's hybrid. It's the hybrid threats. It's the cyber-enabled information warfare that's of utmost importance right now. I may just be rambling a little bit, but then again, I came in and want to offer something, so I'll stop there, and maybe Q&A would be more appropriate. And
Okay,
again, I
thanks,
also
Tom.
apologize for my voice.
Oh, that's perfectly okay. So I did have kind of one question. We'd had some questions or a question in the chat about this, and that is, the decision of the North Korean regime to send troops to Russia and what that might portend. I'm curious in particular what perspective you might have on that.
Yeah, and that's a great question, because here it is. It's again, the threat against the RBIO. It's the alliance of Russia, China, North Korea, Iran, that's forming, all of which to cause the West a series of problems that it has to simultaneously address. And so bringing North Korea into the war in Ukraine is again just another problem set that we now have to confront. And the numbers I'm beginning to see are incredibly problematic as well. I've seen everything from 3,000 to 10,000, and those are not insignificant numbers. And take that and link it right to the BRICS meeting that was there in Russia, one that was attended by the United Nations. I mean, and we begin to I hope grasp the threat that the West faces by this coalition of folks, particularly when we talk about Iran, North Korea, China, and Russia.
Great, thanks, Tom. So moving on to another kind of rosy situation, I guess, around the world. So as you all know, we're now in over a year of the conflict between Israel and Hamas in the Gaza Strip, and in recent months, it's widened significantly and broadened significantly to also include Hezbollah and the Lebanese territory, and also Iran in the past couple of months. And I guess the first question is, why is that taking place? And perhaps more importantly, what are the likely impacts of the campaign to target the leadership of Hezbollah and Hamas by Israel on the conflict going forward, particularly the apparent removal of the leadership of both of those organizations? I don't know who wants to tackle that one first. John? Yeah.
Well, I'll jump in here. There's too much to unpack in terms of a general summary of Israel and Hamas and Lebanon, and Hezbollah in Lebanon. I will just say this very, very quickly. Israel, to its southwest, there is an area called Gaza. And almost 20 years ago, Israeli forces that were occupying Gaza left. They literally forcefully removed Israelis who were living in Gaza, and they turned that back over to the Palestinians. there were what I will call elections that occurred immediately after, and Hamas was elected as the government of Gaza, the newly liberated Gaza, over 20 years ago. Now, since then, Hamas has not had any more elections. I think it's a majority of the people living in Gaza today weren't even alive during those elections. It's a very young population. The problem, and there are many problems, and this is a sensitive issue, and if I describe it too much in one direction, it will sound like I'm pro-Israeli or pro or anti-Israeli, but from the get-go, it's important to note that Hamas, to the United States, to Australia, I believe the EU, to many international organizations, is a terrorist organization. And they are the government of Hamas, of Gaza. Hezbollah in southern Lebanon is considered a terrorist organization by the West. So from early on in its administration, Hamas began lobbing rockets into Israel. And there have been tens of thousands of rockets sent into Israel since, and the Israelis would then come back with targeted strikes against Hamas wherever they had been launching those missiles. This goes on for about 2 decades, and there have been incursions into Hamas territory, but nothing like today. And the reason for today, what is happening in Gaza, and it's happened over the last year, is because of an attack on October 7th. Now, anyone in the chat that's not familiar with Israel and Hamas, you're probably familiar with 9/11. On October 7th last year, Israel experienced its version of 9/11 when Hamas launched a massive attack over the border. They killed over 1,000 Israelis, mostly civilian. They kidnapped hundreds of Israeli citizens and some soldiers. And that's what led to the Israelis going with a full-scale invasion of Gaza. Imagine 20 years, not saying that there haven't been, crimes committed on both sides, but after 20 years of coexistence with a neighbor who is lobbing rockets onto you, the October 7th attack was a bridge too far. The Netanyahu administration was very clear. This is a war against Hamas, and it's not going to end until Hamas is gone. And the vast majority of Hamas's leadership that's not living in a 5-star hotel in Qatar have been killed. The majority of Hamas fighters have been killed. From a military perspective, even though it has unfortunately led to, I believe, over 40,000 dead Palestinians, many of them women and children, from a military perspective, what Israel has done in Gaza over the last year has been as successful as it can be when fighting a terrorist organization. Now, add to that Lebanon. Now, Lebanon, for anyone not familiar with the region, is to the north of Israel. And in Lebanon, for decades, particularly in southern Lebanon, there's a terrorist organization called Hezbollah. Now, they, in recent months, began lobbing hundreds of rockets into northern Israel. And the Israelis have responded with a somewhat limited invasion of southern Lebanon to root out Hezbollah. So you have Israel here having a massive attack from the southwest, from Hamas in Gaza a year ago, and they have fundamentally annihilated most of Hamas. But unfortunately, they've also annihilated most of the infrastructure in Gaza as well. And to the north, they have Hezbollah, who is launching strikes into northern Israel, and they are striking back. Now, at the center of all of this is someone we have not even mentioned, and that is, of course, the Islamic Republic of Iran. Now, Iran funds Hamas, and they fund Hezbollah. That is, these new proxy wars that Dr. Caverly and Dr. Matchok have brought up. This is one of the ways of modern warfare. The Iranians have an interest in the destruction of Israel, but they are also geographically removed from Israel. If you're familiar with the area, it's a long way from Tehran to Tel Aviv. So they have been funding for decades these terrorist organizations, among others, that are striking at Israel. And the reason for the massive attack on Gaza by the Israelis is somewhat obvious. The attack on October 7th last year was horrifying. It was beyond anyone's expectations in terms of the slaughter. And the Israeli response, while you can debate the I almost said pros and cons, but while you can debate the ferocity of the counterstrike given the number of civilians that have died, it's hard to debate why the Israelis are doing what they're doing. It was an unimaginable attack on October 7th, coupled with increased missile strikes to northern Israel from Hezbollah that led to what we see still today, and that is a strike into southern Lebanon. So right now, Israel is fighting on 2 fronts. To the north, they're fighting Hezbollah, funded by Iran. To the southwest, they are fighting Hamas, what's left of it, funded by Iran. And recently, Iran has sent 2 massive strikes into Israel. The first was predominantly made up of cruise missiles, which the Israelis and the air defense system and the U.S. and British naval forces in the Red Sea and the Mediterranean were able to shoot down most of them. The most recent was about 180 mostly ballistic missiles, which are a little bit harder to hit, and many of those got through. And the Israelis have recently responded by striking Iran, directly striking Iran for the first time in their history. I will go ahead and say this: the fighting with Hezbollah and Hamas will continue. The fighting between Israel and Iran directly, I do not expect that to continue. Both sides have shown very little interest in actually having outright war, mainly because of the geographic realities involved. With that, I totally lost track of how long I've been talking, so I'm assuming, oh, there we go, thank you. I will stop right there, but I will say the strategy of decapitating Hamas, and most recently by killing the nominal leader on the ground in Sinwar, who was killed. He was the highest ranking member of Hamas, who again is fighting, actively engaged. While it is very easy to question the morality of what they were doing, he definitely had the loyalty of his Hamas soldiers. So I think that was a strike against Hamas that they will feel. Targeted strikes against military leadership by Israel, I think it has extraordinary advantages, but there can be possible disadvantages. But overall, the Israelis are fighting 2 forces, both being funded by Iran. I do think it is much more serious when you get into Hezbollah, because Hezbollah, unlike Hamas, they are actually Shia Sunni. I think that the Iranians are a lot more connected to Hezbollah than they are to Hamas. I think it's safe to say that outside of their willingness to kill and or murder Israelis, I don't necessarily think Iran cares much about what happens to Hamas, because again, they are Sunni as opposed to the Shia Iranian regime. With that, Israel is in a dangerous time, and they do have the most sophisticated military in the area. They have a number of weapon systems provided by the U.S. They have their own military industrial complex. They develop their own weapon systems. Israel is one of the more powerful pound for pound forces or nation states on the planet, but they are surrounded in this case by enemies. And I will stop there, because if I don't stop there, I will talk for the next half an hour, and I'll turn it over to the others.
Well, I guess I'll jump in here on my part. And then Tom can clean up, I suppose. I think that was overall a great summary assessment of the situation John provided all of us. The only thing I'd like to add, for people to keep in mind, that the modern state of Israel came out of a movement back to the homeland that really kicked off in the late 19th century. It led eventually to something called the Balfour Proclamation. Balfour was a foreign secretary of Britain. And eventually, after the dissolution of the Ottoman Empire and the interwar period and the Second World War, the modern state of Israel was formed in 1948, and almost immediately, the first Arab-Israeli war kicked off. Now, I might be wrong here on my number a little bit. I believe the current one, I think, counting this, I think this is the 8th one. So these folks been killing each other for a long time. The great difficulty is from a foreign policy perspective for the Americans in particular, but the West generally, is that the Arabs have the oil, and we need the oil. But the Israelis have always had more the heart of the American people, so to speak, because of our our shared civilizational, religious heritage, and that sort of thing. And the situation is that the United States and Britain and various other countries have been stuck in between these two forces. Now the Iranians are sort of a third actor in all of this. They're ethnically they're not Arab, they're Persian, and religiously they're quite different than most of the Arabs. Most of the Arabs, as John pointed out, are Sunnis, and Israel or Iran, the Iranians are Shia. And so I agree completely with John's assessment that, would they sacrifice Hamas to save Hezbollah? I think absolutely they would. I think very much they may dislike Hamas almost as much as they dislike Israel. But in recent decades, basically since 9/11, Iran, in its own attempt to become a regional power, it's built a lot off of its own fuel stocks, energy supplies, and they have modernized their military, and they're a very wealthy country, and they got a great big army, and they're no longer bled to death by the Iraqis that they had in the Iran-Iraq War back in the 80s, and so this is an opportunity for them, a little bit maybe like North Korea, for them to flex their muscles a bit. They operate through third parties, as John pointed out. The problem the Iranians really have with Israel is that Israel's too far away. They have a big military, they have a modern military, but they use a lot of their military just to keep their regime in power. And that's true with a lot of those countries in the Middle East. And so they don't have the power they don't have the ability to project power. The Israelis sort of have the opposite situation. They can project power. They have the technological aspect. They have the professionalization aspect. They have small unit to large unit. They got the whole 9 yards. The problem is they don't have people. And they got money. The Israelis got a lot of money. They're the number one recipient of American foreign aid, and British aid. Plus they're a industrialized country themselves. They're highly agricultural, and they're very powerful. But they don't have people. And the difficulty that they're going to have, and they're going to continue to have in this fight, is how long can they keep doing it? Because the problem with Gaza is that, the problem with counterinsurgent warfare is that whenever you bust down a building, you produce a new fortification for people to hide behind and snipe at you, and to hit you with ambushes and stuff. And they have militarily overwhelmingly won. I mean, they have destroyed Hamas. But the difficulty with a terrorist organization, and America knows this very well, so do the Brits, because we've had a lot of experience with this now. They're a many-headed hydra. You could kill Sinwars all day and half the night. There's going to be 4 more to replace them, and they got a bunch of young people that are coming up who just lost their mother and father, and there's going to be a bloodbath for 40 years, as there has been for the last 40 years and 60 years, and that's a shame. And hopefully, calmer minds and clearer hearts will come forth, and maybe through development and stuff like that, we can maybe find a way where they'll stop killing each other and stop destroying what goes on, because it's a very sad situation. That was more of a rhetorical appeal than anything else, but anyway.
Well, John and Matt, thank you very much. And I certainly cannot add very much to what you both have contributed to the conversation. A particular interest to me, and possibly this is what I can share, and that is my interest in what is the Middle East going to look like tomorrow. And we talking about the here and now, talking about what's emerging on the ground on a daily basis, and from a political science perspective, possibly, or from a peace studies perspective, asking that question, well, what is the Middle East going to look like when this is done? What will Lebanon look like? What will the political situation in Lebanon look like with a larger Hezbollah, a no Hezbollah? Will its role be there? What will the governance structure in Gaza look like? Will the Palestinian Authority have any say in any of this? What will it look like when this is over? And what will Syria look like? What will the situation in Jordan look like? Let alone in the Gulf states. Let alone will Iran be stronger or weaker coming out of this on the other side? So I think there are a lot of questions that we probably need to be asking, now, not only to get a good, solid understanding of what is happening on the ground, but where is this taking us? I mean, Shakespeare certainly, I think, summed it up quite well when he talked about war and said, "Cry havoc and let slip the dogs of war," because they spin out of our control. War sort of becomes its own. We say in the military, a self-licking ice cream cone. It has its own logic. It has its own utility, and it follows that. And in many ways, leaves us on the sidelines, not having control. I think this is why we in the political science world, I think, spend a lot of our time at the as we say, left of boom. What's conflict prevention? We don't want the balloon to go up because we realize at that time that's when we do lose control. So I guess I'm rambling on, but my interest is in our studying now and are asking these questions now about what will it look like 10 years down the road, 20 years down the road? What will the Middle East look like? And so that we can help shape those events rather than simply react to them. And on that, I'll go ahead and stop.
That's a great point, Tom, about the future. That's one of the areas we can look to this. I think I can make some estimates. Under the Netanyahu regime, I will guarantee Hamas will not return to Gaza as a recognized leader of any sort. But again, future administrations in Israel might change that. I would also guarantee that no U.S. president, Republican or Democrat, would ever allow Israel to fall. I think former President Trump, is something of an X factor. I don't mean that in a good or a bad way. He has shown himself to play outside of the normative political box, but generally speaking, the U.S. Would, not to mention NATO, but the European Union, the U.S. would never allow Israel to fall. I don't see that changing anytime soon. I think the true tragedy / possible bright light at the end of this would be weakening Hezbollah and Lebanon, because Lebanon, if anyone isn't familiar, and I'm not an expert on this, but this is relatively well known, it is a diverse nation state. Their government actually requires that at the highest levels, they have a Shia, a Sunni, I believe, and a Christian. If I've got those three off, someone correct me. Lebanon represents what could be the greatest of civilization, but it is hampered by this cancer that is Hezbollah. Although, having said that, I didn't mean to be overly optimistic. I do not in any way see Israel wiping out Hezbollah right now at all. That would definitely lead to more attacks. It's important to note that after a year of aggressive counterattacks in Hamas or in Gaza, in Iran, but once the Israelis went into southern Lebanon and started to directly attack Hezbollah, that's when Iran started launching what I would say are, I don't want to say PR missiles because that is a horrible sentence, but I think it was more political. They weren't going to annihilate the Israelis. They were not going to remove them from the world as a sovereign nation state. But Iran got involved with missiles, cruise missiles, and then eventually ballistic missiles once Israel started to attack Hezbollah. So in the future of that particular region of the world, other than those guarantees, Netanyahu will not allow Hamas back, and the U.S. will never let Israel fall. That's the only thing I would branch out to say a guarantee.
You know, John, I certainly can't take any issue at all with what you suggest. What I would like to add to that, and that is, I think conflict across the Middle East presents an excellent example of what can happen when a structure becomes addicted to the violence, and the number of people across the Middle East who benefit from the conflict and from continuing it, and who have absolutely no interest in reducing or ending the conflict, because there's just too much money to be made in some quarters. There's also the political stature that comes. There's the status that comes from being part of some of these organizations, and so the conflict itself becomes the raison d'etre for everything, just to continue it, and so, you know, as I said, not getting off too far, far afield, but looking what happens when conflict structures become so important to the identity of the people involved. The other part of that is, and as you said, militarily, in many instances, the hardware fight is the easy part. It's combating the ideology, and how do we eliminate that ideology? Because that itself then gives life to these conflicts, and so in many ways, we're stuck, because we can win the combat, we can win that piece of it, but we don't win the ideology piece, or the ideology piece gets stronger, and then on the other end, we have so many parties involved that aren't even interested in ending the conflict. Their whole goal is to keep the thing going, because they're benefiting from the whole damn thing to begin with. So anyway, I think it's and this is a insight into the new wars that we're looking at.
Okay, thank you all for a very interesting discussion there. Let's see. Just to kind of update people, I just saw announced literally in the last 30 minutes that Israel has now passed 2 laws that ban the Palestinian Refugee Agency UNRWA from operating in Israel. So and the occupied territories. So another development there that certainly could have some consequences down the road. For those who aren't familiar, the UNRWA, or United Nations Relief and Works Agency for Palestine, I believe is its full title, has been sort of the refugee agency for the Palestinian refugees since the 1948 Arab-Israeli War, they were certainly a lot of members of UNRWA UNRWA were implicated in the attacks of October 7th, rather, and so I don't know what the long-term consequences of this are going to be, but definitely a development that could lead to some serious political machinations down the road. Let's see. So, I just didn't want to spring that on you, since I don't expect you to have any comment on something that literally happened 30 minutes ago. But I did want to make our audience aware of that. Let's see. So we're down to our last 15 minutes or so. So I will let the our our panelists decide which topic they would rather discuss. So your choices are you can either, well, I guess you got three choices. So we can talk about the new Mexican president and how that may impact U.S.-Mexican relations going forward. We can talk about the issues involving India with the Sikh separatists and their efforts to try to eliminate some of those people in North America, and how that's led to some diplomatic conflict and perhaps could lead to some problems with a relationship with a country that the U.S. has been trying to develop a better relationship with over the last few decades. Or we could go back and talk about one of the other topics we've talked about today, or we could take an audience question. Although I don't see any other audience questions, so I don't know how. Does anybody have any particular preferences?
Well,
Or do you want me to choose?
I'll jump on both very quickly. For anyone
Okay.
in the audience not familiar, Mexico has just elected their very first female president, which is in and of itself historic. No preference. This is important for understandable reasons. Women make up over 50% of our species, and this is the first female president of Mexico. Former mayor of Mexico City, educated in the United States. I think one of the more important elements here is that she is in the physical sciences. She studied in the U.S. She has had extraordinary success in the past in Mexico City, dramatically reducing violent crime in Mexico City, dramatically increasing the successful prosecution of violent criminals in Mexico City. She is advocating for an administration that will have continual breakthroughs in women's rights in Mexico. So this is overwhelmingly a possible, very optimistic chapter in the history of Mexico. Not advocating for or against her policies in the past or getting into political promises, but she has had success in the past. So that is, of course, an extraordinarily interesting reality that has occurred in one of America's most important. I always get them mixed up. If Canada or Mexico, I think Mexico might be our most important trading partner. So that's an exciting time. Now, speaking of Canada, Canada has, if you're not familiar, one of the largest, if not the largest, Sikh populations outside of India. And they had last year a prominent Canadian citizen who was a Sikh advocating for a Sikh independence movement in India, who was murdered. And the Canadian government has accused the Indian government of being complicit in that. Obviously, the Canadian government accusing the Indian government of being complicit in a murder of a Canadian citizen is a serious issue in foreign affairs, which has, of course, chilled relations between those two nations. That's the quickest summary I can give of both of them. With that, I will open it up to everyone else with the last few minutes that we have. If they want to fill in any gaps there, I left out a lot. But Mexico has just elected its first female president, and Canada is accusing India of murdering one of its citizens because that citizen took part in an independence movement in India that has very little chance of success. But the Canadians are accusing the Indians of murdering one of their citizens as a result.
Well, I'll jump in here a little bit on the issue with at least with President Sheinbaum. Particularly regarding as the America's relationship with Mexico regarding the U.S.-Mexico border. And also America's relationship with Mexico regarding the U.S.-Mexico-Canada trade agreement. In both of those cases, we have an interesting set of possibilities coming up regarding who wins the American election, because President Trump has had a bit of an adversarial relationship with Mexico. particularly over the border, but also over trade. And Vice President Harris has had a little bit more of a friendly relationship with Mexico on those same subjects. Now, the great difficulty is that let's say it is Harris. Well, Harris is going to inherit that Biden did shut the border down. He didn't shut it down completely, but he put in a lot of the executive order, and there's talk about she wants to go ahead and basically if they get the border deal that was tanked previously last year, I guess it was, she said she wants to sign it. Now that could be a place for some controversy between us and President Sheinbaum. And regarding the other area, the whole bit with tariffs, if it's a second President Trump has said that he's gonna nail Mexico with tariffs, and that is a potential place for conflict. And Mexico is a fascinating country because Mexico, on one hand, if you look at one body of empirics, Mexico is what some international relations theorists refer to as a middle power. It's got a vibrant middle class. It's an industrialized economy. It's one of the great agricultural producers around the world. It has a first-rate policing and military structure, and so on and so forth. I mean, it's a player, and on some levels, it's a country on the rise. Unfortunately, if you look at another body of empirics that look at Mexico sort of through the weeds and in particular areas, you have kind of the exact opposite of everything of what I just said. And so, and a lot of the conflict with the United States is built off things like this. The perception by the U.S. Border Patrol that Juarez is out of control and is effectively run by Mexican drug cartels who are fueled by South American or Mexican drug gangs that are fueled by Colombian cartels. But yet, anybody's ever been to Baja California knows it's a major tourist place with the Yucatan. It's a major trade with America, and so this is going to be an interesting fight. But I think it's really going to depend upon who wins the American election. And I think it'll be a more friendly relationship, if you will, under a Harris presidency than it will be under a Trump presidency. But you know what? I've been wrong before, so we'll see what happens as to which one of them gets that. Okay.
Well, I'm going to go ahead and defer on this one, in that I have absolutely no expertise in this area, and I was just realizing how uninformed my knowledge is of the Western Hemisphere. Yet again, but no, and I do appreciate the comments that were made, and certainly when I look at Mexico, my interest is security along the border, and again, back to the hybrid threats that are a result of that, asymmetric warfare, those types of things. Certainly, Mexico needs to be a partner there, as do as does all of Central and South America. We are the Americas, and we all have interests in security across the hemisphere. And Mexico is as I think Matt, you rightly point out, is a key player. It's a middle power. It's a linchpin. It's certainly the last stopping point before entering the United States. But our security cooperation along that border has ebbed and flowed, along the way. Uh, I think. Well, let me hold there. I don't want to get too far off in there because, as I said, that's not really my expertise, and I don't want to misspeak, I guess, or so.
Oh,
Okay,
I wanted, if I could make one more minor comment here, just to say the connections between the United States and Mexico. Um, the Latino population is America's largest um, um, minority group. Now, Latino is you can be any race and be Latino, so it's just more of an ethnic category. But and among that group, although the trend lines are shifting, but among that group, historically, the Chicanos, the Mexican Americans, have been the largest of that group. And so, this is regardless of who wins the American election, America has a vested interest in the nation state and the people of Mexico, because a lot of Americans, particularly in the southwestern part of the United States, but really throughout the country. I mean, you go here in Georgia, I think it's something about 10% of the population of Georgia is Hispanic. Obviously, they're not all Chicanos, but they're a powerful voting bloc. They're a powerful entrepreneurial group. They're a powerful labor group in our market. And it would be very foolhardy to ever underestimate America's relationship with Mexico, because it is a truly interdependent relationship. Now, we are the more powerful position on that seesaw, but it is an interdependent relationship. We are dependent upon them as they are dependent upon us, even though we're in a more powerful position relative to them. And that's something that we don't have necessarily. If you wanted to draw a contrast, we just left the topic of with Gaza, and there's nothing against the good people of Gaza, but we don't have that kind of historical and cultural and economic and political relationship that we do with Mexico. Anyway.
Yeah, thanks, Matt and John, and of course Tom. Yeah, I think just to piggyback on what Matt, Dr. Cavalier was saying, about I'm looking at some statistics now from the Pew Foundation, and their estimate is there's about 64 million Hispanics living in the United States, of whom about 37 million are of Mexican origin, right? So that would tell you, doing the math off the top of my head, right? Probably on the order of about 60%, I guess, of Hispanics or Latinos or Latinas are of Mexican origin, with Puerto Ricans being the second largest group at almost 6 million, which not to get too much into contemporary domestic politics, but it certainly has become a bit of an issue in the last 24 hours. And I refer you to Google if you are not familiar with that. And we'll see how much of an impact that has in a couple of weeks. So speaking of a couple of weeks, so I'd like to thank everybody for joining us today, particularly our panelists, but also our audience as well. I'd like to thank you all for coming out. So our next event will be 2 weeks from today, on Monday, November 11th. We'll be discussing the outcome of the 2024 presidential elections, assuming we know what they are by that point. I expect we probably will, or at least if we don't know what they are, then we'll have a pretty good guess. So that will be our next discussion, not just presidential elections, but also the impact on Congress and state elections, referenda, all sorts of exciting and fun things as well. So we hope that you will join us, and hope you'll invite some of your friends to join us as well, so we can get some better turnout. If you're interested in reviewing this video later, or looking at some of our past discussion events, they are available on our YouTube page, and this one will be available on our YouTube page probably in the next day or so. And that is just youtube.com/@MGA Paul Sign. So you have to put the @ in there on YouTube. Nowhere else but on YouTube, you got to put the @ or you're not getting the right place. So we will get that video up in the next, like I said, the next day or so. So keep an eye out for that. Again, thank you all for coming out, and we appreciate your questions from the chat. We appreciated our panelists, and I will hopefully see you all soon. So take care and have a good evening, everybody.
Thanks, Chris. Thanks, Matt. Thanks,
Thank
Tom.
you all. Thank you.
Thank
Good, good seeing
Thanks,
everyone.
Chris,
and-
John, Tom. Thank you, everybody. Thank you for coming out and seeing us. Take care.
Great.